Hello everyone, my name is Alpina, and today I'm sitting down here really excited to talk to you about the internationalization of national firms. So before I get started with my presentation, I would like to give you a quick rundown of everything I'll try to cover, starting with the theories and the models from three different perspectives: the economic, the strategic, and the process perspective. Then I'll talk about the internationalization in Latin America, in Colombia, and then finally we'll talk about the study case and the company that I've chosen, which I'm really excited about. And I'll also make sure to let you know that in the bottom of all the slides, I've included the authors and the projects that I've referenced for my research. Full references will be at the end of the video, just in case you're curious on any of them. And then, without further ado, I'll get started. So, theories for internationalization of firms, theories, models, all of these projects done by scholars date back approximately 60 years with Stephen Heimer. He was the first person to work in this area, and he did so in 1960. We will talk about him in just a minute. And I'd also like to mention that for a long time, so basically from 1960 till basically 1990, early 2000s, most of these theories and most of the work that was done around this subject was done focusing on companies and multinational companies from developed countries. So there's not a lot of studies even now that focus on companies, multinational companies from developing countries, which we also call multilatinas. And most of these work and these projects that we find on multilatinas are based on observation. But we will talk about those later. And now I'll start with the economic perspective theories. So, like I mentioned before, Stephen Heimer in 1960, he was the first person to make a comprehensive analysis of multinational companies and foreign direct investment. His work centered around the fact that in order for companies to go abroad, they had to develop these strong competitive advantages, which are also referred to as monopolistic advantages in their home markets. And they are able to develop these advantages when these markets have imperfections. So these strong competitive advantages are what's going to allow these companies to actually have a leverage over their competitors abroad, and it's actually the basis for the whole internationalization process. Then I'd like to talk about Peter Buckley and Mark Casey. These guys focused on these strong competitive advantages, but their work was centered around competitive advantages that are intangible. So instead of physical assets, they focused on things such as managerial abilities, marketing, skills, operational know-how, technology know-how, and their work was centered around the fact that these intangible capabilities, these intangible advantages, are not only the most expensive to transfer, but it's also really difficult to do so without compromising the actual source of advantage. So what they suggested was for companies that have this type of advantages to internationalize, but using own subsidiaries. And the reason why is because by doing so through own subsidiaries, you're able to keep control over your assets, and you're also able to prevent your know-how from diluting. And these sort of problems tend to arise when you try to profit from your competitive advantages by using models such as licensing and franchising. Then we have John Dunning. He developed the eclectic paradigm, or which is also known as the OLI framework. Basically, what he did was bringing everything together into one model, and he mentioned that in order to go abroad, three conditions had to be met. So the first is around ownership. By ownership, he meant companies needed to have these own specific advantages, and Once you have these own specific advantages, you will be able to transfer those into foreign markets that are to be selected by specific location advantages. These location advantages are things such as free trade agreements, specific characteristics in the demand, the potential of the market, and overall these markets having more pros than cons. And then finally, to bring it all together, by going abroad, you should be able to profit in the best and most profitable way possible from these advantages. So now I'll move into the process perspective. The process perspective, we have the Uppsala model, which is an incremental step-by-step process that is based on the empirical experience of four Swedish firms. So this is a model that was developed in 1977 by two Swedish scholars. And like I said, it's based on experience of companies that were successful internationalizing their processes and their businesses. And basically, what these scholars found was that the best way, or the way that it should be done, is incremental steps. So the first contact that you do with markets abroad is through exports, which is basically the smallest kind of commitment you can make in terms of personnel, time, and money. And then as you learn about your internal processes, as you learn about foreign markets, as you reduce uncertainty, you start to commit more gradually. So we will move to independent reps, then you will move to establishing subsidiaries abroad, and then finally the ultimate commitment will be greenfield investment or a wholly owned subsidiary, which is the biggest kind of commitment money-wise and time-wise for a company. This model and this step-by-step was not a mandatory, but they did recommend companies to do things gradually in a time-consuming sort of way in order to reduce uncertainties as much as possible. Then we have Vernon and the product life cycle. Basically, what Vernon does with his work was to link the internationalization based on country factors and link it to company factors. So he talked about how competitive advantages from a company developing a product, an innovative product, change from the moment they are still in the developed country and as they move towards developing countries. So here I'll show you this graph because it will be easier to explain. So basically what Vernon inferred was that innovations tend to arise and tend to happen in developed countries where people have the disposable income available to sort of invest in these innovations and these new products. So companies develop products in developed markets and then they start exporting. And as they start exporting, they also start to considering setting up production facilities in other developed countries. So once production starts sort of being done in different countries, the price per unit starts to go down because now built into the price of the product, you don't have transportation costs, labor costs are also a bit cheaper. So as the cost per unit starts going down, also the revenue starts growing, and then of course the buzz around the innovation, it keeps growing, and then progressively other less developed economies sort of pick up on it, and also competition. So at this stage, we're moving from growth to maturity, and then in maturity, you will see that the most developed countries where innovations are sort of born, consumption starts slowing down because new technologies and new innovations will be arising by this moment, and then less developed countries, they start pushing not only to have these production plants in their countries, but the consumption in these less developed economies starts picking up as well. So then by the end of the maturity sort of stage, moving on to the standardized phase, we have the market being divided now by competitors. So firms that have followed up and that have copied the initial innovation, and the innovative company that brought the product uh, to the market will be basically exiting the market at this stage. And now we have sales, most of the sales being done in less developed countries. Then finally, we have the theories and the models from the strategic perspective, which in my opinion are the most interesting. They're also far more recent than the others that we've talked about so far. So starting with the network approach in 1988, this approach, it doesn't go against any of the other theories or models that we mentioned. It's sort of a complementary approach and a complementary theory. So basically, what it says is that it doesn't focus on entry modes, it doesn't focus on competitive advantages or advantages of any type. It focuses on relationships, business relationships that the firm engages in as they conduct business. And when firms start internationalizing these networks, these relationships become larger and larger. And so the main focus, the main idea here is for companies to pay close attention to the network they are working in. Because when you focus on the type of network you are working in, you're able to sort of identify the roles that other actors have. You're able to identify their strengths, their weaknesses, and therefore you're also able to see what opportunities and what constraints are in the market and in the sector that you work in. So it's sort of a possibility that companies have. They just really need to be uh, focused, and they need to be, say, really purposeful in watching out for these networks and watching out for these connections and how they can learn. Then we have the Born Globals, or the International New Ventures. This is a theory or model that came about in 1993. So there are, many different definitions. The one that I like best is here is companies who have reached a share of foreign sales of at least 25% within a time frame of 2 to 3 years after being established. So this model is sort of it's a contrast to the Absala model that we talked about before, because the born globals are companies that within 2 or 3 years, like I said, they're able to move abroad and gather a significant part of their revenues and their income from the outside countries from their home market. And why does this happen? Many reasons, but mainly the fact that now with communication technologies, companies can have e-businesses and handle e-businesses from anywhere in the world without having those high fixed costs that they had in the past. So with a good idea, you can go abroad and handle customer service and handle business relationships and business um, sort of projects and business related stuff with minimal costs, because you can do so from anywhere in the world, and that's a way in which you grow revenue real quickly, and you do so with the less cost possible. Now we have internationalization in Latin America. So uh, internationalization in Latin America, in the 1950s, the region was starting to come together, um, and regional integration started to happen. Then we go all these years, and then in the 1990s, with the Washington Consensus, that was sort of the stepping stone for the economic and the competitive transformation of the region. So in the 1990s, and also thanks to socio-political stability and good international relations, most of the countries in Latin America and most of the big companies in countries in Latin America started to look to the outside markets. Uh, but I don't mean by outside markets, I don't mean necessarily going into different continents. They started looking at their own region, but this was, a huge transformation and a huge difference from what we had seen in the previous years. So I have these numbers, for example, here in the presentation where it says in the 1990s, we went from 15,000 million in outward FDI for emerging economies to 45,000 in 2003. So we can see how much of an impact this developing country multinational companies made in the outward FDI growing so much. And then also a big reason why um, sort of the outward FDI started to grow was also the fact that we not only had regional economic integration, but we had that transform into trade agreements and into intra-regional trading preferences, which also was a huge aid into boosting and motivating companies to grow into other markets in the region. So, like I said before at the beginning of the presentation, developing countries, multinational companies are also referred to as multilatinas. Most of the multilatinas are still at a really early stage. It's we don't have a lot of global multilatinas, but I put some examples in here. We have Cemex, we have Bimbo, we have Petrobras in Brazil, and we also have Piña Concha y Toro in Chile. And then a good Colombian example, which a lot of people are, um, aware and familiar with, is Nutresa. But we also have, other multilatinas, which are ISA, Koala, Casa Luker, and then, okay, now I'll talk about the internationalization in Colombia. So, like I mentioned before, and pretty much in 1991, it was the economic opening, the official economic opening, which was a major breakthrough for the national economy. This forced companies sort of to reassess their competitive strategies because they could see that soon, competition from other countries in the region was going to start to, come into the country. And also, I'd like to mention the fact that for many companies, internationalization was seen as a way to survive, which I don't necessarily agree with, but it was an observation that needs to be made. Also, some common aspects of the internationalization processes of companies in Colombia is the fact that success for most of Colombian multilatinas has been a combination of theories. Following a single theory hasn't been the path. Companies and their success, you can see sort of a lot of different approaches. Companies tend to follow the Asala model more than other models. Also, exports is the most common way for Colombian companies to go abroad. And also, a thing that I would like to point out that I saw while I was doing research and while I write about multilatinas in Colombia is that for scholars and researchers, it was really hard sort of to work on these success studies because companies wouldn't, in most cases, be willing to give out information. So most of the studies were based on observation and outside data because companies wouldn't really reveal, specific numbers. Okay, so yeah, like I mentioned, in later stages, so Colombian companies start doing exports, and that's the most common way. But when they're going into later stages, they prefer mergers and acquisitions to greenfield investments or joint ventures. And also, Colombian multilatinas are similar to other regional multilatinas in the fact that they tend to prefer markets with low psychic and physical distance. And by low psychic distance, I mean countries with same currencies, same type of political and cultural systems and traditions, same religion, same language. And now, really excited because we finally arrived to the study case. The chosen company here is going to be Alpina. Like a lot of you probably are familiar with, Alpina is a market leader into dairy products in Colombia. It's actually the third largest company. Um, from inception, it's a company that has been extremely focused on innovation. It's actually innovation and high quality are two of their four strategic pillars, and we will see how innovation has really been a reason of their international success later on. Um, Also related to the fact that they're really innovative is the fact that they launch about 36 products per year in the time from 2000 to 2012. And you will see if you start looking at all of the products that they've launched, that they've been really successful. So some of these products are, the first mature cheeses like the Emmental, the Gruyere, the Parmesan cheese, first of these type of cheeses being made in Colombia. They were also the first company in Colombia to produce yogurt, to produce cumis, to produce lactose-free milk. They were the first country in South America to introduce the concept of the bonyurt, which is cereal and yogurt together in the same presentation. They were also the first company in the world to actually have a ready-to-go, long shelf life oat smoothie. So also their innovation is not only confined to their products, but it also has to do with the way they do their retail operations. So they were one of the first dairy companies in Colombia to have their own points for direct sale. They were also one of the first companies to put their products into vending machines, and with the joint venture that they have with Nutresa, which is called La Receta, they've also been pioneers in venturing into the Oreca or institutional sales channel. So, a quick rundown on the story of Alpina. They were founded in 1945, 1970s. They began introducing global standard and global practices into their production in the 1980s. You can say that they really began to do aggressive um, geographical expansion in Colombia, and then in the 1990s, sort of what we mentioned, thanks to the regional expansion and the regional change, in terms of competitiveness, it was also the time where they began doing their first exports abroad. So their first three markets were Venezuela, USA, and Ecuador. Like I mentioned, so Venezuela it was in 1993. Their first export was a caramel export, and what happened was they made an alliance with a company in Venezuela. It was a Danish company called Plum Rose, and what they did was they made an alliance, an agreement to sell to them and export to them for sale 70 tons of caramel monthly. So we will see later on how successful they were. Within a year, they were already thinking about setting up, their own plant in Venezuela. What happened with the United States was that in 1995, they got the FDA approval for exporting their dairy products, and then in Ecuador, exports began in 1996. So with this map that I have here, you can sort of see how they've staged their international presence. So at the lowest level, we have the exports. Currently, Alpina exports to 16 countries. Most of them are countries and islands in the Caribbean, but they also have presence in the US, they have presence in Canada, and they have presence in Peru and Ecuador in South America. They have distribution centers in Colombia, in Ecuador, and in Venezuela, and likewise, their production plants. They have five in Colombia, they have two in Ecuador, and they have one in Venezuela. So in terms of exports, um, in 2008, exports were about 4.5 million, which was up 19% from 2017. And last year, they were projected to end at a 25% higher than 2018. So they've been growing, and they haven't only been growing in terms of how much revenue, they've been bringing in, but they've also been growing in terms of volume. So in 2019, by August, the company had exported 2,600 tons approximately, which was up 34% from 2018. From the exports, we know that the US market, the Canadian market, and the Caribbean market altogether are about 69% of all the exports that Alpina does. The reason being here is that we have FTAs with all of those countries, so it's easier for Alpina to enter these markets. Like I said, some of the barriers or the main barriers that the country faces in terms of exports is the fact that for a lot of these countries, there are not clear regulations in the admission of dairy products. So that's one of the main barriers. Also, the price competitiveness and sort of building and challenging these barriers, the company have set up their goals, which is going to be focused on increasing their market share, increasing their portfolio. They plan to enter Panama and Jamaica by the end of this year, and they also plan to strengthen their agreements with their distributors and their resellers because they want to have pre-orders. So they don't want to send products and then have stock piling up. They want to have pre-orders so that they don't have to worry about stocks and claims and returns later on. So an incremental stage to exports, sort of the next stage is what they have going on in Peru. So it's a co-production partnership. So Alpina has been exporting to Peru since 2008, but in 2012 they realized that they wanted to be more aggressive with the Peruvian market. So what they did was they made an alliance with this company, Andina Alimentos. So the first thing they did was conduct market research and to see which products they were going to focus on. So they decided to focus on the oat smoothies and the Regeneris yogurt line. And since 2012, Andina Alimentos has been doing the production part and have also been doing the marketing part for Alpina in Peru. The next stage will be what they have going on in the US right now, which is their own subsidiary, which was called Alpina Foods, which is and it has now transformed into Climb Your Mountain Inc. Their subsidiary in the US was started in 2009 and it's located in Miami. So the reason why the company decided to set it up in Miami is because it has the biggest Hispanic population. So therefore it is the market with the lowest psychic distance, one of the lowest psychic distance markets in the US. So from their subsidiary, they've been handling product development, market operations, and national distribution. Currently in the US, Alpina has presence in about 4,500 retail stores like Walmart and Publix, Winn-Dixie, and Serrano's. And up until 2019, they actually had their own greenfield investment. So in the US, they set up their subsidiary in 2009, and in 2012, they decided to make a greenfield investment. So create and open their own plant, which they did in Batavia, in New York. This plant in New York had the goal of producing all of the products or most of the products that were going to be sold in the US market and also manufacture dairy products for third-party companies. And they were, really successful at the beginning, but unfortunately, they took the decision to close it last year because they lost a lot of these third-party contracts that they had going on. So this is basically what they had going on in the US. And then sort of in the same stage level, they still have their plants in Venezuela and in Ecuador. Their plant in Venezuela was an international acquisition, so they didn't set up their own plant. They bought a plant that was already in Venezuela. It was the plant that was manufacturing Joe Plate. They bought it in 1994 for around $4 million at the time. It's located near Caracas, and they're mainly working on dairy drinks, their product line for juices, and they're also focusing on butter. This plant in Venezuela has sort of become smaller with all the political troubles lately. So they used to have around 500 employees. Now they have about 150, 100 employees. But the plant is still profitable and it's still going on. And then what they have in Ecuador is sort of a mix of the two. So one of the plants was an acquisition from an Ecuadorian company, and then one of the other plants that they have is a greenfield investment, which they made in 2003 and was around $6 million the cost. It has a 1,000 ton capacity, and Ecuador is one of the biggest markets and is one of the sort of pivotal bases for distribution uh, into the South American market. So that's what they're sort of trying to build there. So as a conclusion, and before I close out this presentation, um, you know, Alpina, what we saw, Alpina is a company that follows sort of the Absalom model approach. So they have, like I mentioned, it's a stage approach. They have exports, but they've also moved into markets that they've had more time developing. They've moved into bigger commitments. So the subsidiaries, the wholly owned plans, and so it's been an incremental, stage by stage, step by step approach, like the one suggested by the Upsala model. But if you know or if you research a little bit into Nutresa, what Alpina has done is very similar to what Nutresa has done. So we could also say that they sort of use the network approach and sort of the theory that John Matthews developed, which is looking at your network and learning about internationalization by watching, doing, and repeating what others have done. And you could also say that they've used the OLI framework. So they've been able to develop in the Colombian market this innovation advantages, these innovation capabilities, which they've transferred into other markets abroad, into the Caribbean, into the US, products that are really just new to these markets, like caramel, like oat smoothies, and they've actually made these international ventures really profitable. So, with that being said, just really thankful for your time. I hope this was a good sort of opportunity for you to learn about internationalization. And thank you very much for your attention. And